History as It Happens, December 20th, 2024. Religious right and left.
The word prolific more than applies to television legend Norman Lear, the visionary behind...
My name is Norman Lear.
Let me tell you something, Mr. Bunker.
No, let me tell you something, Mr. Stivic. You are a meathead.
That there's just one Christian position, and implying if we don't agree, we're not good Christians.
I really believe that the pagans and the abortionists and the feminists and the gays and the lesbians who are actively trying to make that an alternative lifestyle, the ACLU, People for the American Way, all of them.
What happened to the religious left? Was Norman Lear, the famous TV sitcom producer, its champion before the rise of the religious right? What can we learn from All in the Family about the weakness of the religious left today? Let's talk religion and politics, why don't we? Next, as we report history as it happens. I'm Martin DeCaro.
Yes, that's right. You don't believe me? Read your Bible. Read your story of Adam and Eve there.
When we're talking about religion, spirituality on the left, liberalism, religious liberalism, these kind of broad terms, religious left, to me, we have to think a bit more broadly. Typically, we assume the religious right to be this monolithic Christian kind of entity that's imagined into this catastrophic force in the public square. Not wrong, I suppose, but at the same time, a lot of it is constructed.
Father, I pray for my president and our president. I pray for you to give him boldness. I pray, Father, for him to defy and challenge giants in the world and defy and challenge the enemies in this nation.
About 6 months before the 2016 election, so about 6 months before evangelical Christians would help deliver the White House to Donald Trump, a professor by the name of Alec Ryrie delivered a lecture at Gresham College titled "The Religious Left in America, Invisible or Non-Existent?" We could ask that same question today. As Ryrie said, the religious left wasn't always in such disarray. They helped elect Jimmy Carter. But then 5 million evangelical voters switched from Carter to Ronald Reagan in 1980.
The televangelist Pat Robertson had Carter as a guest on his show and later said that Carter was the one who activated me and a lot of others. And Carter's eventual election victory depended on the fact that, unprecedentedly for a Democrat, he'd won more than half of the evangelical vote. The new religious left was on the march. But as you may be aware, it hasn't worked out that way. In 1980, when he ran for re-election, 5 million evangelical voters switched from Carter to the divorcee Ronald Reagan. Since then, there's been a lot of attention given in the United States to the religious right, but much less to an equally remarkable phenomenon: the absence, or rather the invisibility, of the religious left. Despite the fact that many American Christians have political concerns traditionally associated with the left, repeated attempts to mold an organized, vocal religious left have run into the sand. The result has been a strong impression that, as one junior Republican congressman bluntly put it in January of this year, we, the Republican Party, own the entire biblical tradition.
The shift in the religious vote did not escape Norman Lear, the ingenious, groundbreaking TV producer and writer behind All in the Family and several hit spin-offs.
The way Glenn Miller played.
Songs that made the hit parade.
Guys like us, we had it made.
In that election year of 1980, Lear produced a TV ad, a kind of warning about the danger posed by the religious right or moral majority, televangelists like Pat Robertson or Jerry Falwell, whose remarks after 9/11 were typical of his morally bankrupt worldview.
What we saw on Tuesday, as terrible as it is, could be minuscule if in fact God continues to lift the curtain and allow the enemies of America to give us probably what we deserve. I really believe that the pagans and the abortionists and the feminists and the gays and the lesbians who are actively trying to make that an alternative lifestyle, the ACLU, People for the American Way, all of them who tried to secularize America, I point the finger in their face and say, you helped this happen.
So why don't we go back to that TV ad in 1980? It depicted not a liberal college professor ready to deliver a condescending lecture to help conservatives see the light, but a working class fella in a yellow hard hat operating a forklift at a construction site.
Hi, I have a problem. I'm religious. Well, we're a religious family, but that don't mean we see things the same way politically. Now, here come certain preachers on radio and TV and in the mail telling us on a bunch of political issues that there's just one Christian position, and implying if we don't agree, we're not good Christians. So my son is a bad Christian on 2 issues. My wife is a good Christian on those issues, but she's a bad Christian on 2 others. Lucky me, I'm 100% Christian because I agree with the preacher on all of it. Now, my problem is, I know my boy is as good a Christian as me. My wife, she's better. So maybe there's something wrong when people, even preachers, suggest that other people are good Christians or bad Christians, depending on their political views.
If you oppose religious tests for political office, call 1-800...
And so was born People for the American Way, the subject of historian Louis Benjamin Rolsky's fascinating study, The Rise and Fall of the Religious Left, Politics, Television, and Popular Culture in the 1970s and Beyond. If Norman Lear could be considered a religious leader, TV was his church, and his scripts for All in the Family were his gospel. Through the character of Archie Bunker, who incessantly argues with his wife, daughter, and son-in-law, Lear hoped to expose racism, sexism, and religious bigotry with satire.
You see how it is talking to you? That's you all over. That's your, what do you call, attitude, see? You're prejudiced against Tommy Macklin because you know he's a white guy.
I don't know anything about him.
I just told you he was a white guy. So? That's why you hate him. You are prejudiced against white people. Don't tell me no.
Crazy.
I ain't crazy. If I told you that Tommy Macklin was a black guy, you'd be crying tears and saying, give the poor ex-con a chance. But you know he's a white guy, so you're against him. Well, I ain't prejudiced that way. I ain't prejudiced against no man just because his skin is the same color as my own.
Well, as Rolsky contends, Lear and like-minded religious liberals attained social influence, but not ultimately political power. Or not the same level of political power achieved by the religious right, which is now a dominant force in the Republican Party. You might remember this disturbing scene 4 years ago, evangelical Christian leaders placing their hands on Donald Trump, a man who doesn't know the Bible from a cookbook, to pray for him and our country.
Lord, I thank you that America didn't need a preacher in the Oval Office. It did not need a professional politician in the Oval Office, but it needed a fighter and a champion for freedom. And Lord, that's exactly what we have.
Now, could you imagine that happening in a Democratic White House? So what happened to the so-called religious left? How should we define it? If it won the most important culture wars of the 1970s, the wars fought on network television, why did its influence wane? Louis Benjamin Rolsky is an affiliated fellow at the Center for Cultural Analysis at Rutgers University, and he is the author of the aforementioned The Rise and Fall of the Religious Left, published by Columbia University Press. Welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for having me. I can't wait.
Yeah, you are a listener, a dedicated listener. Now you get a chance to listen to yourself. I hope you enjoy that. Some people don't like to listen to how they sound.
Understandable.
So this is your very first time on the show. Tell us a little bit about your background as a scholar. What brought you to the subject of religion and politics, which I must say I need to spend more time discussing. And I think people, Americans in general, have to focus on a little bit more.
Oh, well, thanks. These questions have been sort of at the forefront of what I've been doing for a while. And I started as a historian and decided to take a class one day on religion of the world in college. And in many ways, the rest is history. I go on to different sort of graduate degrees and start exploring, like you said, the relationship between religion and politics, religion and public life. And in many ways, it's part of, I suppose, who I am. My family's always been debating such things. The popular culture we consume is always sort of interacting and exchanging and engaging such things. So in many ways, it's a professional commitment and also sort of a biographical one, a vocation I take into the classroom and try and communicate the best I can, a very complex and nuanced subject, especially now.
Nuance. What's that? Well,
I know, right?
Religion and politics, they say those are the two subjects you're not supposed to discuss. But if you're not discussing those things, then what are you talking about? I mean, that's what's interesting, but there is a lack of nuance. I've probably been guilty about this myself as a fairly militant atheist, the way I speak about religious subjects, but we can get into that here. because, I know you exist because of Twitter, now X. I mean, it's not an entirely useless social media platform. I started to spot your posts. You're among a number, I'm not putting you into a group per se, but you're among a number of historians, I'll generally say, on the left, who are frustrated with the way people on the left and liberals discuss religion, right?
Yeah, not only religion, but ideas of politics, of progress, of culture. I mean, I was just having a conversation last night with a colleague of mine, Tyler Austin, for The Atlantic, and we're just sort of chit-chatting. And I sort of just observed to myself, liberals can make the most compelling, like wonderful television about politics, but doing politics, like in the actual real world, has been a tremendous challenge. And in many ways, it's kind of ironic. I mean, some of my favorite things to consume, like Veep, House of Cards, you think about the wonderful popular culture on politics and public life, Parks and Recreation, I've written about that. So we have this wellspring and reservoir of vision and public life and civic imagination, but in some ways falls flat, once it reaches the public sphere, if you will. So yeah, I mean, the more nuanced, the more slowly, I suppose, we can talk about these things, the better.
No, it comes down to how the left views its opponents on the religious right, or just people who, say, voted for Donald Trump, being able to connect with them without just dismissing them because you disagree with some of their ideas on, say, cultural issues, what have you. I mean, the Democrats used to be pretty good at this. They used to have socially conservative, but economically on the left union workers in their coalition. Not anymore. So let's get to the topic and try to connect past and present. I picked up your book, The Rise and Fall of the Religious Left, not expecting what was in it. I had no idea what you had written about. I thought I was going to read about clergy and left-wing religious activists and the influence of the religious left in, say, presidential politics, people who oppose the Vietnam War, Martin Luther King Jr., I mean, he was a reverend on the left. That's not what you wrote about. The subtitle really says it all. Politics, television, and popular culture in the 1970s and beyond. You chose the lens of Norman Lear and his amazing television career, all the great TV shows he put out in the 1970s when television really mattered. There was only a handful of stations. There was no cable. There was no internet, no nothing. Archie Bunker, All in the Family. Yeah, I never thought of Norman Lear as a religious figure. Why is he a religious figure?
Wonderful question. So I, in my doctoral program, I was working on, different things in classes, and I started writing my dissertation on Norman Lear, partly biographical. I had been kind of raised on 70s television by my family for sort of various idiosyncratic reasons. And I had an intimacy, a familiarity with it. When we're talking about religion, spirituality on the left, liberalism, religious liberalism, these kind of broad terms, religious left, to me, we have to think a bit more broadly. Typically, we assume the religious right to be this monolithic Christian kind of entity that's imagined into this catastrophic force in the public square. Not wrong, I suppose, but at the same time, a lot of it is constructed. And so Norman Lear is someone who I wanted to focus on because, yes, like you said so eloquently, we have King, the Berrigan brothers, of course, like you said, anti-Vietnam in the 60s and 70s. So we have these case studies. But for me, the religious left is a broad, cacophonous construct, if you will. Not to say that doesn't exist out in the world. It certainly does. But these are turns of phrases. These are journalistic enterprises that we're sort of talking about, and scholastic ones as well. Talking about religion and spirituality on the left, we're talking about, to me, someone like Norman Lear, who late in life purchased William Frost's home and held little seminars basically every year for the, liberal intelligentsia, if you will, like the Bill Moyers. They would go and talk about religion and spirituality and nature of existence, that kind of thing. And
he had allies. He had allies in churches too, right? They were more center or leftist clergy or church denominations. Is that how you'd put it?
Yeah. So I mean, I had a great time, writing about Lear's eventual creation of People for the American Way and his association with people like, Martin Marty, who's a very well-known professor, but he's also a minister. He's interacting with deans of Yale Divinity School at the time, who are also kind of middle left, ecumenical figures. Part of the religious left is that it's kind of a patchwork. It's It's diverse, it's cacophonous, it's interdisciplinary, it's multi-religious, it's pluralistic. It's oftentimes difficult to leverage, in public life on behalf of this kind of political aspiration, that kind of political aspiration. So for me, I wanted to talk about, this topic having to do with religion, but from a slightly different angle. Maybe one that people weren't expecting, but maybe saw every night as they were watching All in the Family.
Yeah, that was his gospel, the discussions and debates in the living room of Archie Bunker and Meathead. So Norman Lear was Jewish. He didn't seem particularly devout or religious in his Judaism, but religion mattered a lot to him, and social issues mattered a lot to him. Not because he wanted to impose his ideas on society, because he was worried about how the right, as he saw it, was imposing its ideas on society. What informed his view of this? You mentioned some of the things or people who influenced him in his younger days. FDR, Father Coughlin, or is it Coughlin, the preacher, the anti-Semitic preacher in the 1930s.
Yeah, that's where it all starts. And in some ways, Lear is spending his early life in Hartford, Connecticut, but perhaps more importantly also in New Haven. So he's close enough to Yale to overhear things about quotas and how many people are able to be accepted on a given year. He is glued to the radio, just glued to it when it comes to fights, listening to fights with his father in the famous chair that's now in the Smithsonian Museum. He's listening to FDR and he's writing to presidents because he's brought up to express himself. And his family, everyone encouraged him to write to the president. Dear Mr. President, oftentimes Lear would say. And in many ways, that's how my book got started, not to get too far afield here, but the book really got started with me discovering a series of letters between Norman Lear and Ronald Reagan, published in Harper's in 80, 81 or so. And it's this kind of civic vision that Lear has, kind of like a mid-century liberal, tri-faith America. But that kind of letter writing, that kind of civic, maybe broadly sort of Jewish commitment to pluralism, his involvement in World War II, literally fighting fascism, I suppose, in Europe, like literally, not as far as like the, discussions we've had or sort of the discourses about all that kind of stuff, right? So he's literally like flying missions over Italy. So, he comes back, he gets into television. He's reading the writings of Justice Learned Hand, kind of a mid-century figure of law who talks about the spirit of liberty, which is something that Lear is big on when it comes to people for the American way, envisioning and imagining sort of a liberal understanding of the public square. So Lear's influences are coming from different places, and his Judaism comes to the fore oftentimes when it comes to issues of discrimination. There's sort of an infamous quote about, I can't remember who said it, but someone on the right broadly says, God does not hear the prayer of a Jew. And that's something that Falwell has to address. That's something that Lear brings up. So it's certainly there. It's just understood in the old school tri-faith America, World War II sense of Protestant, Catholic, Jew.
Charles Coughlin, Father Coughlin, or is it Coughlin? I'm embarrassed to say.
I mess it up too.
He was on the radio in the days, in Lear's childhood, when the radio was the medium. He was a Catholic priest. He was a populist, anti-Semitic, pro-fascist. That left a mark on Lear, right, about the dangers of the right wing. And at the time, the government had standards, and I'm not saying I agree with this. I'm a First Amendment, pretty close to a First Amendment absolutist. But the government actually stepped in and denied Coughlin his platform after a while because of the incendiary nature of what he was saying. You mentioned this in the book. By the way, before you answer that question, Coughlin, he died in 1979, so he may have watched All in the Family. He probably did at some point.
That's an amazing connection, though. I wish I could somehow explore that. I have a bunch of stuff on Falwell and what he thought and all that kind of stuff, but that would be amazing. Yeah, right around that time, I have a chapter about the FCC and how the FCC, begins to kind of step in and regulate airwaves, and someone like Coughlin, is not necessarily seen as the most sort of kosher, if you will, sort of subject, I suppose, for the airwaves. And so in some ways that begins, Lear's understanding of this abrasive right-wing populist appeal. But then the government's also kind of looking at it too and sort of divvying up or trying to figure out, how to regulate the airwaves. It's such a fascinating idea, this idea of the public interest. Like, where does it come from? How is it compromised? Who defines it? It's such a wonderfully complex idea, and I got to read all these law articles, if I remember, for that.
Wow. Yeah.
Chapter.
Which ideas are aligned with the public interest and which are beyond the pale? I mean, when it came to All in the Family, right? You had people saying, this is not what Lear's making it out to be. This is one-sided, making conservatives look like a bunch of pig-headed bigots. And
what's so fascinating is, being in radio and, coming from radio yourself, like the public interest determines in some ways, like who has access, basic access. And I mean, at the time, the story becomes based on Coughlin's kind of example, and then how the federal government starts to lean kind of mainline when it comes to the FCC and how it sort of regulates licenses and that kind of stuff. So then that creates this dynamic of middle left denominations, radio programs really getting free airtime. The dynamic between the free airtime and then the airtime that conservatives are going to have to work for and pay for. The entrepreneurial spirit, depending on how much we want to get into it, of conservatism going after the New Deal. And this is a formative moment, like conservatism, how we're defined, comes about in this moment, and Lear is doing this all at the same time. So it's a really fantastic case study, for what we mean by, I suppose, liberal and conservative, and how they get aligned with ideas of the public interest, which then regulates everything. Yeah. In some ways, like you see it in All in the Family. So it's such a fascinating connection.
So what our listeners need to do is not only go back and watch All in the Family, which I intend to do now after reading your book. It is actually streaming. It's on one of the streaming services. You can watch all of the original seasons. But the other thing they have to do is imagine a time, when there wasn't streaming, there wasn't cable, there wasn't internet, there's nothing except network television. And network TV is deliberately made to be the least offensive, least political, no politics. So no one is offended. It's truly what some people might consider family programming, right? This is the 1960s. Lear comes to television and he says, enough of this stuff. Why don't we use TV to get people to think? Relevancy programming. Talk about the importance of this as we peel away the layers here of what would become the religious left.
Yeah, wonderful question. So relevancy television, I think I found that somewhere. I borrowed that from a book on this time period. Lear is looking across the landscape and he's kind of echoing the sort of public assertion that television is a wasteland. There's that famous speech, I can't remember, some executive basically calls it a wasteland, Mr. Ed.
Hello, I'm Mr. Ed. A horse is a horse, of course.
Bewitched, Beverly Hillbillies.
That's better than reality TV.
Story about a man named Jed, a poor mountaineer, barely kept his family fed.
In some ways, and that explains a lot if you want to get into that when it comes to reality television. But yeah, exactly. So think about that. You've got talking horses, flying witches, hillbillies in Beverly Hills.
For some people, even now, they don't want politics in sports. They don't want politics in TV. They do have those choices now. You can find anything you want. But in those days, to put a political show on primetime, right, that was a big deal. Go ahead. I'm sorry to interject.
So now we have to get into what is a political show? What does it mean to be political? The Trinity shows in this time period are All in the Family, MASH, and Mary Tyler Moore. And Lear is the one who is in the lead. I have these wonderful quotes where Larry Gelbart and others, spearheading MASH, they're looking to Norman to see what Norman will do. So he's kind of setting the pace.
He sees it as a place where you can have these one-act plays, which was All in the Family, where you'd have real issues to be discussed and debated. And Lear wanted to introduce these ideas to people, not necessarily tell them how to think, although he probably was criticized for doing just that.
I don't know necessarily if you would understand it as like a political show. Lear wanted to make TV that could be applicable, that was didactic. And that's what I saw in the spiritual, civic dimension of the show. Each character is a metaphor for a major force at the time, whether it was hippies or young women or say housewives like Edith who are kind of realizing their sort of station and how their younger daughters are illustrating that and the conflict to do with all of that. So Lear was very purposeful. He had his writers, read headlines of newspapers and really wove life into the show. And so for him, in some ways, it was doing something that he thought was timely, relevant. But the only way that it really got going, though, or that the networks were kind of interested in it was because it was seen as hip. It was kind of seen as something to be in the know about. It would be appealing to younger demographics. So in some ways, it's like a blending and marriage of economic and cultural interests. You have networks who are driven by certain interests. You have this very risque programming that's on CBS. And so Lear on the first episode has to fight standards and practices for suggesting that Meathead and his girlfriend, Gloria, basically are going to like mess around when the parents are out of the house. And that was the first huge battle between the network and Lear. And it was almost not going to happen. And Lear thought to himself, if I fold here, nothing's ever going to work.
What are you running away from me? Come here. Gloria, we have been living with your folks since we're married. We don't get the house alone that much.
Oh, we're not alone. Lionel's upstairs.
Lionel, why?
He's fixing the portable TV for Dad. No, Michael, not now. I don't have any time.
Gloria, they don't get out of church till 11:30. It's a 10-minute walk. We got time to spare.
So that was the first conflict. But the network, All in the Family started with a disclaimer that the network put up before the show. And not unlike South Park's disclaimer, which is all satire and tongue-in-cheek, the network was like, this is a look at our frailties and this is kind of satirical and not meant to represent blah, 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 blah. So the network was really, really concerned. They didn't know how it was going to go. They had additional people at the phone banks to get phone calls. So they didn't know how it was going to go.
Not just the kissing scene, I guess, or kissing on screen when the parents are out of the house, but the language, right? As far as I know, the N-word was never used, but I do remember Archie referring to black people as jungle bunnies.
Stanley, they're really very nice people,
Oh,
Archie.
yeah, very nice. They're wonderful people. They're lovely people, Lita, but they are also colored people.
Better hold it there, Daddy.
Now, listen, little girl. Been around a lot of places, I've done a lot of things, but there's one thing Archie Bunker ain't never gonna do, and that's break bread with no jungle bunnies.
The term gooks was used to refer to Vietnamese people, among many other racial slurs.
What are you talking about? You put a Jap and a Chink together, you're gonna tell me which is which?
That's right, because I find out about them. I talk to them as individuals.
Sure, you talk to them. You say which one of you guys is the Chink.
Yeah, people weren't saying words like that on TV. So are you laughing at or laughing with Archie Bunker? Lear wanted to expose what he saw as dangerous in American society, right? Religious intolerance, racism, and sexism. And he believed, and even Carol O'Connor, you quote him in the book, also believed that by showing it in this way, people would get it right. That they would realize we have to move past sexism, racism, religious intolerance, etc. Looking back on it, were they effective? And how does this reflect the rise of the religious left?
So it's a delicate question, and this is all satire. That's the assumption, is that you kind of go in knowing that. As I've gotten into this, or as I've gotten a little bit older, or maybe picked up some more anecdotes, over the years by people who watched the show, because hundreds of millions of people watched it every week. So there's a history just to be told in that. I'm getting the sense that, like you kind of suggested, that a lot of people didn't really understand it like that. The New York Times freaked out, did a bunch of studies about if the show actually increased racism, actually amplified it. You had op-eds, pretty critical ones, going after Lear for making things worse. So in some ways, this is a very debated enterprise. From the very
people
beginning.
are agreeing with Archie Bunker. The white backlash to civil rights was a real thing, but go ahead, yeah.
And to connect today to yesterday, we've known this for some time. It's not like there's an out of touchness. I suppose there is, but there's also a tradition of condescension, of satire, of kind of exposing. People for the American Way becomes one of the first right watch groups in America. So there's something to that. I think there's some nuance there in the sense that we've known about deplorables ever since the 1970s and maybe even longer ago. So the idea that it's been a surprise is just mind-blowing. To me, I explain it, there's a tradition of condescension, which is often masked as satire. But, we've known about this for some time. It's just been a matter of coming to terms with it. Archie really hasn't gone anywhere.
So Lear then creates a problem he hoped to dispel.
It's a very complicated legacy of the show, like you're suggesting. It was on for a decade. Hundreds of millions of people watched it a week. Lear would do an episode of hypertension in the Black community, and people would go out the next day and get tested. That made him so happy. Like the happiest that he could ever be, really, was to hear something like that and something like that happen. This is the kind of naivete maybe of like liberalism or American religious liberalism, like we can make wonderful shows about Archie or Leslie Knope and, Parks and Recreation, but it just translating it into the actual world is the challenge.
Well, you say Lear was excellent at achieving cultural influence, but the left in general, or the religious left, was less effective at obtaining political power. Why don't we talk about then the people that Lear was opposed to, although he didn't see himself as like personally at odds with some of these figures on the religious right, but that's how it was often framed. The religious right, the moral majority, today they're the evangelical right. You had people like Pat Robertson, Jerry Falwell, people who I personally despise, but that's beside the point here. They saw Lear as a threat. They were reacting to him, and that's where we get this conflict.
It's funny, I stumbled upon a quote, and I'm pretty sure it's Falwell, who basically calls Lear the number one enemy of the family in America. But by the time that Lear starts creating even more television shows, not just All in the Family, you think about it, Sanford and Son, Good Times, The Jeffersons, and I would especially say Maude.
Because there was an abortion episode with Maude, right?
Yes, there was. It was a 2-part episode.
Look, there's only one sensible way out of this. You don't have to have the baby. It's legal now.
She's right. It's legal in New York State. You better give that a thought.
I have given it a thought. Oh, I don't know. I just don't know.
It actually had Catholics laying out in front of executives' cars in New York to protest the idea. This was a major problem. So by the time that, Lear gets to creating people for the American way, he's the apotheosis of liberal religious America in some ways.
So the rise of the religious right during these years, the Republican Party was not married to it at this time. You had pro-choice presidents, Gerald Ford, especially his wife. The notion that you'd have people on the right handpicking Supreme Court justices as they do now for Donald Trump, that really wasn't the battleground then, right? The battleground was TV, culture, pop culture. That was the culture war before it really got into the politics the way we see it now, right?
Think about parallel trajectories, so religious left, religious right. And part of my point was to say that they're intermeshed. We have to see them as being kind of interacting with each other, co-constituting. Lear got annoyed because it's like, I'm tired of being reported with Falwell in these stories because we're not as aggressive or we're not as confrontational, blah, 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 blah. But to me, I wanted to sort of focus on, the other side of the culture wars. Scholastic intervention is to say that all this work is on the right, all this work is on Falwell and the Robertsons, but who are they responding to? Is there anyone on the proverbial quote unquote like other side that's actually spearheading anything? A vision, an actual vision.
Well, I think Lear was correct to say that the religious right or the moral majority, people like Robertson, Falwell, did want to scrap the separation of church and state and did want to impose their social mores on all of society by, say, banning all abortions. But their critique of Lear was also right, maybe in a way that he didn't want to give them credit for, because Lear would say, I'm not telling people how to think. We're debating, we're discussing these issues through the characters of Archie Bunker, Meathead, Edith, and Gloria. The audience can make up their minds, who's right and who's wrong. But come on, you're watching All in the Family and you understand what Lear's getting at. Archie is wrong, and Meathead had his problems too. But the idea was to expose ideas like racism, sexism, that Lear equated with the threat from the right at that time.
You just have to look at episodes and the titles, and it sort of gives you a sense of, where he's coming from. And I was lucky enough to, when I was interviewing him, stay with a family friend who was a co-writer for an episode on Gloria Discovers Women's Lib. It's the actual title, that's what it's called. And it's this amazing expression and articulation from Gloria. But then Gloria is kind of asking her mom, like, Mom, why are you doing this every day?
Boy, oh boy, a woman sure has no chance to express herself around you. It's as if she were in prison. She can't grow, she can't change. She's second class, half a person.
Hold it there, little girl. Oh, them ain't your words. Where you getting all that from?
Oh, Gloria has been reading a book about women's lib.
Oh, jeez.
3 books, Daddy, and I didn't read them, I devoured them. Not only that, I had Michael read them, too.
Mike? It ain't enough that he's a pinko and an atheist. You're gonna turn him from a man into a morphodite?
The tricky thing about all of this is that kind of hindsight, meaning I don't want to necessarily overly read into the television of this political kind of tablet or checklist, in the sense that, like, looking at it from this time and seeing the titles, you'd imagine, wow, like, look at all these issues he's bringing up. But then if you were to ask him, like you said, and it was always so frustrating because he never would admit what he was really up to. But to ask him at the time, like, Norman, were you doing something political? I don't know, necessarily how he would answer that, because he would remind us that, Archie Bunker also reminds us of the kind of frailty of humanity, or like the human condition itself.
He had a heart. He was a person. He was a likable guy, even though he held some attitudes that weren't so nice.
And Lear said, depending on if we buy this or not, that he didn't say anything in the shows that kids didn't hear like every day on playgrounds. So you can buy into that if you want to. You don't necessarily have to. That's kind of, up to the viewer. But yeah, it was meant to be an illustration, a didactic illustration of a classroom, discussion-oriented, figure out your political kind of aspirations, kind of a perfect world.
So how does the right fight back? They didn't get their own primetime TV shows. How did they fight back?
We saw this in some ways at the beginning of November, in some ways like the path to political power. How does that happen?
Well, it starts in 1980 with the first conservative president, although Reagan was not a culture warrior.
Maybe going back to those letters, Norman's writing letters to Reagan, and he's expressing his concerns about, I'm concerned about the First Amendment. I'm concerned about something fascinating that he says back in the day, Christian nation movement. That's an interesting phrase in light of Christian nationalism, blah, blah, blah. But that's how the book started. And that's how Lear kind of understood Reagan as this continuation of a potential threat. But now it's in the White House, the moral majoritarians, as he would say. And it's those turns of phrase that I'm really interested in, because it's connected to deplorables, it's connected to how we conceive of conservatives, and just a rich sort of wealth of information.
So they fight back, going back to my question, in the cultural sphere. I mean, we know how they did it politically. Phyllis Schlafly and the others, they become more and more influential within the Republican Party. And now evangelicals are a dominant force in the party. But in the cultural space, they did things like what? Boycotts and campaigns and publicity, right? They would criticize Lear's programming as being anti-family and all this other stuff, right? Were those campaigns, boycotts, whatever you want to call them, were they effective?
Yeah. Donald Wildman, he's a figure of the kind of religious right. And, you're aware it's a catch-all term that's meant to homogenize and catch for journalistic and kind of academic kind of reasons. So, yeah, I would say so. But Donald Wildman, you have political action committees being started. You have organizing started by conservatives and sometimes religious conservatives, going after Lear. But at the same time, like the Richard Vigories or the kind of figures of the new right, like Kevin Phillips. I mean, even someone like Richard Nixon, brings up, not to jump all over the place, but like Nixon brings up on one of his tapes how the American people should treat Archie more kindly and they shouldn't be as harsh and they should understand him. So as far as like how it sort of weaves its way into the
and it's a
popular kind of imagination.
It's a sprawling subject: culture, politics, local, state level, national, getting the courts to rule in certain ways, school boards taking over school curricula. I mean, all of this is in play, even though people on the right do complain with reason about how the left commands so many cultural institutions. I mean, the right isn't doing badly. I mean, they have the Supreme Court. They have a lot. I mean, look what happens when Bud Light did a stupid commercial with a trans activists or whatever happened there. I mean, look at the public anger that was generated on that.
You know what I would say? The right is much better at advertising. It's much better at marketing. And Lear and Bunker are persuasive. Like, people are watching it, hundreds of millions of people. But at the same time, like, to me, what you just said, or woke or any of these other things, like, they're all sort of distraction. They're all kind of like little micro marketing schemes, which is why, I want to kind of redefine how we study the right and conservatism and all this. And I write about kind of the conservative leverage of direct mail, the fascinating kind of way of communicating with everyday, quote unquote, everyday people. And to me, that's where all this really, like, the rubber hits the road. It's the fact that Falwell or Wildman could put something together and discredit all of that, or create some sort of, distraction. So to me, what we get, wrong and right about conservatives, say what you will, but since the 70s, I have this great quote and some other work I'm doing. The left used direct mail to raise money. The right used it to move the country. So to me, it comes down to that kind of marketing and advertising and getting people to actually, like, get out and vote. Like, go figure.
So how does the left misunderstand or misread the right today? A couple more questions I want to ask you in our conversation. One is, who is the religious left today? It's not Norman Lear or anything like that anymore. There are a million choices on TV and streaming. But my first question was, how does the left misread, say, the evangelical right that has taken over the Republican Party? The left critique is these people are closed-minded and they want to impose their social morals, their religious ideas on the country through the force of law. Look no further than Roe versus Wade. The right would say with reason that the left imposed its morals on the whole country with Roe versus Wade in the 1970s, when abortion had been illegal in most places in the country. But where are they wrong?
There's a story to be written about how the right has been studied in the United States, how the right gets talked about, how the right gets analyzed, whether it's in discourse or podcasts or articles or op-eds or all of that. It's a very unique subject matter as far as how it's kind of imagined and written about. This is where we don't have to get too far into it, but it's the idea of Cold War liberalism and how it sort of shaped America, and how, say, McCarthyism, the impact McCarthyism had on the American people in the 1950s, especially academics. So long story short, what do we still get right, at least from an academic or maybe journalistic or scholarly vantage?
Or get wrong. I mean, dismissing the religious right as only a group of Bible-thumping dummies. There may be people like that, but they wouldn't have the Supreme Court and all these other institutions if they were dummies. You got to take people seriously and also treat them with respect. I think maybe there's a lot of condescension on the left as well.
Now I'm thinking of something different, like a different example. So before Lear created People for the American Way, he was going to do a movie called Religion. And he actually worked with Richard Pryor and Robin Williams on a script. And the story was going to be, you had the good-natured liberal pastor doing all this good stuff. And then you had another person who gets caught up in the electronic church, in televangelism. And the sort of liberal, good-natured person actually ends up rescuing the other person, because the other person gets lost in the ego, gets lost in the screens, in the electronic church, which in and of itself is a dig, is a criticism.
Yes, this person needs to be saved. He needs to be saved from his right-wing ignorance is the message.
Sure. And even that, you think liberal mainline compared to more conservative evangelical, which is more, storefront, which is more electronic. The electronic churches itself was a criticism. You have no real building, you have no real institution, you have no real congregation. But at the same time, they had a congregation or an impact that people on the left could only dream of. could only imagine. So in some ways, there's a point to be said about creating the very monsters that you were fearing.
Yeah, I mean, is there a liberal mega church today where like-minded people go and on a Sunday or whenever, I don't go to church anymore, by the millions, TV or whatever it is, you can, I guess, stream the services. But yeah, I get your point. Who is the religious left today?
I would answer it kind of differently. So at the time, and if you do a quick search, the major figure linked to articles on the religious left is someone named William Barber. Depending on the time and politics and culture and what's happening, he will kind of pop up every once in a while. I remember when I was writing, there's a New York Times piece. His picture is right there. And the article's like, the religious left has sat out of politics for the last 50 years, but now they're getting back in the game. So in some ways, like, it's very spotty, sporadic, and really disorganized. I think Barber is a professor type at Yale Div now. So in some ways, it's kind of been institutionalized. In some ways, that's why I also put fall in the title, because to me, like, ever since this kind of time period, and because of dipping into culture and, maybe some other things, there's been a real kind of fading away. And, why has that been the case? But you ask today.
Well, the Democratic Party, the Democratic Party's not that comfortable with maybe that type of thing. Donald Trump's not a religious person at all, but he had a meeting at the White House. There's a photo out there where he's surrounded by all these evangelicals who are treating him like the savior. You don't really see pictures of Joe Biden or Barack Obama in the same context.
No, and what I've been critical of recently is, someone saying, whatever we mean by Christian nationalism. Trump wouldn't know an evangelical if he bumped into it, and to kind of put all of this discourse of Christian nationalism ever since his first presidency has been really kind of mind-blowing. And to me is the most recent chapter in the liberal academic misunderstanding of the right. It's the most recent example, and going back in this next project I want to do, a lot of these categories are initially developed in studying and trying to understand McCarthy. The John Birch Society, the most extreme dimensions that could challenge the public square, could challenge the public interest. Sounds like Coughlin and Coughlin again. Let's jettison all of them from the public square. And now we're back to where we are today.
Well, that's not an effective strategy. You can't. They're part of our society.
I know, but that's kind of the imagined story as far as regulation, and there's a way of kind of manipulating public sphere and getting it to produce a certain thing. But yeah, that's the tradition that I'm talking about. And whether it's Archie or McCarthy or deplorables or whatever it is, there is a line. It's a fairly consistent one.
So the religious left, whether we're talking about Norman Lear or anti-Vietnam War protesters, whoever, was once very active and concerned and influential in persuading the public on any number of social justice issues, civil rights, anti-war, what have you. My main critique of the Christian right today, I don't see a lot of talk about, what Jesus was talking about. Jesus was not, maybe I'm not the best authority on this. I was raised Catholic. I went to Catholic school, used to read the Bible. I don't recall many lessons Jesus Christ focusing on what gay people are doing and abortion and all this other stuff. Culture war issues important to the right today.
No, I'm right there with you. And so, I'm just thinking of something that I've maybe never put into words here, but the extent to which we dip into culture and leverage culture. We've seen that maybe backfire for some people or work out for some people, depending on kind of where you're coming from. But this 70s time period, when what we call the new right forms, we can debate about what it means and blah, 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 and conservatism, blah, blah, blah. But
a lot of the same issues, though. A lot of the same issues. Gay rights, abortion. Go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah. And so what I'm saying is that there was a lesson learned, meaning I think there's a limit to what you can do. And that's the discussion today about, did you do too much? Did you do too little? The new right kind of realizes how and learns how to run single issue campaigns that are then wedded together in political action committees and all the infrastructure, the direct mail that really gets off the ground in the 70s. Like you've suggested, and what we should think about is that these histories are interrelated and they're kind of shaping each other as they're happening. Whether it's Lear writing letters, like who who would read those, I suppose, to Reagan, that becoming something that Harper's publishes. Like, when people read it, what is that all about? Like, could you imagine something like that appearing today, like in a magazine like that? Like, that would just be fascinating. I don't even know what I would even describe it.
Of all the criticisms I have of Donald Trump or any president, the fact that he doesn't know a Bible from an Italian cookbook is not one of my problems with him. I don't need my president to be a religious person at all. I'm electing a politician, not a pastor.
Wow, no, that is such an amazing quote, because like that is such a cool thing to say, in the sense of like, you don't expect that. But to see the kind of leveraging and wealth of analysis that has put so much on this one figure, holding up a Bible upside down, right side up, as long as everything is entertaining, it'll be fine. And that's kind of where we're at, for good and for ill, I suppose.
Father, in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ, we come before you, Lord. We present our president. We come together from all denominations, all races together, as the Bible says, to pray for those in authority. Father, let your kingdom come.
On the next episode of History as It Happens, it'll be Christmas Eve, and we'll talk about a remarkable event that took place on Christmas, 1914. Remember, new episodes every Tuesday and Friday. My newsletter, which is free, every Friday. Sign up at historyasithappens.com or search for History as It Happens on Substack.